And I'd like to welcome you to the Wilson Center on behalf of my colleagues at CUSP, Lauren Hertzer, who is one of the people who made this meeting possible, and Allison Garland. And if you don't know the center, it's the official presidential memorial to Woodrow Wilson. And it's been in this location for about 10 years. For about 30 years, it was in the Smithsonian Castle. I'd like to welcome you to the seminar on the right to the city within the context of the upcoming World Urban Forum in Rio de Janeiro. Before I turn and we turn to substantive discussions, I'd like to mention that this event is the center's contribution to the World Habitat Day events around the city. They've been taking place all week, and I have to say it's really been, for me, and I'm sure for many people in this room, very exciting to see the energy and the interest that these events have attracted. I very much want to congratulate our friends and colleagues at UN Habitat and at HUD for an impressive array of events that have been taking place. And the Rockefeller Foundation has been very much involved as well. For me, what has been the most rewarding is in the lead-up, Habitat and HUD managed to create a community. There are 30 organizations around town that have participated in these events, and I think many of us knew some of the other organizations, but this has been, if nothing else, and there's been many other things, but it's been a very successful little experiment and program of community building. This morning's discussions very much reflect the kind of coalition building that I was just talking about. This is the first of 4 meetings designed to be a bridge between World Habitat Day, which was on Monday, and the World Urban Forum, which will be held in Rio de Janeiro in March. These seminars, all 4 of them, are a joint venture with CHF International and the Rockefeller Foundation. And we have very much enjoyed working with our colleagues in both organizations. At CHF, I want to mention Judith Hermanson, who helped conceptualize the series, Jen Carroll, Matt Chandy, and Megan Garrity, as well as Ben de la Pena and Bob Buckley at Rockefeller. And Ben, in particular, has been a partner in conceptualizing the program. You may want to mark your calendars. The additional seminars will be the morning of Friday, November 20th, the afternoon of Thursday, January 7th, and the afternoon of Thursday, February 9th. If you receive notification about this meeting, you should receive notification about the other meetings, but if you don't or you have questions, just get in touch with Lauren or Allison or myself. The Rio World Urban Summit is going to be organized around the theme of the right to the city. Now, this initially was conceptualized by French social theorist Henri Lefebvre in 1968, and the concept has been used by a variety of authors and social activists concerned with the growing issue of social exclusion in the late 20th, early 21st century cities. Moreover, I think there are a lot of people who have been working in the same area without using the concept, and as always, concepts like this, which are used by scholars in different disciplines, are used in different ways by social activists in different communities, these concepts become borrowed, changed, they are transformed into something which perhaps the original meaning wasn't. They become very useful tools, and the more useful they become, the more generalized they become, and the less rigorous they're used. The concept in the American discussion, American domestic context, became, I think, especially important following Don Mitchell's 2003 monograph, The Right to the City, which focused on the right of the homeless to be visibly present in cities. There are other theorists who have used the concept. David Harvey comes to mind, many others. And given this complex lineage, I think it's not surprising that it's been grabbed onto by many people, including the people at UN Habitat, as an organizing theme around, around the World Urban Forum. Well, I can't think of a better group to get us started in the discussion of the right to the city within the context of the World Urban Forum. I'm not going to go over biographies. There was a sheet available outside with the program has all the titles of people. So I've more than spent my time, so I'm simply going to turn the floor over to the four speakers. They've been told they have no more than 20 minutes, and a little bit less would be a little bit better. We'll hear first from Bob Buckley, then we'll hear from Matt Chandy, Celine, and then Anna Maria Argilagos. And again, you have your program, so I think I'll leave it at that and just turn it right over to Bob.
Thanks, Blair. What I thought I'd try to do this morning is, since this is a discussion of the road to Rio, to give a bit of a laconic history of where we are, what that road is, and where it might go, so that we could chat about some of the dimensions of it. And what I want to use are three historical reference points, and that's 1996, 1976, 1996, and 2016. And I'll come back to why I selected those and how the road to Rio fits into it. But I want to use those points and talk about three of the most involved donors, and that's the World Bank as the largest multilateral, the U.S. as the largest bilateral, and the UN, and how they fit into this in kind of a brief history of the world, if you will, during this time period, so that we get some perspective on where Rio is and where it fits into 2016 and so forth. So I selected those three dates. 1976, it was the first Vancouver conference on habitat, and you know, if you think of the world economy at that time, it was a much poorer place. The world per capita GDP was about $3,500, and it's about $10,000 today. So, you know, we've substantially enriched the world in general since that time. That conference convened and resulted in the development of UN Habitat. I was at the time a young economist at HUD and helped write Secretary Hill's speech to that. But it was we viewed it largely as something that was external to HUD, external to the domestic policy agenda, and a bit of kind of international public relations. It was rather weakly engaged, if you will. But if you think of 1976 in a couple of other ways, it was a period, it was just at the end of the Cultural Revolution in China. India had not yet really gotten out of what the Indians jokingly refer to as the Hindustani rate of growth of about 1% a year. The ideas in the world, one of the big issues was the population bomb, and both India and China implemented policies to stop that growth, and India fortunately stopped it rather quickly, and China persisted in it. But so those are kind of some broad issues where we were internationally. Domestically in the U.S., you had the race riots in the late 60s and the establishment of HUD in some ways almost as a response to that. And you had a sense of a new urban agency, and it was established in many European countries at about the same time. So you had a recognition of urban problems and the complexities of it and the public role in that. So that's some sense of what 1976 was like, very briefly. And so the world convened and established UN Habitat. If we go to 20 years later, 1996, we had the second large forum of that sort in Istanbul, and this was again bringing together the world community to talk about urban issues. I think it was called Urban Finance, and again it was a large collection of people coming together to talk about what's going on in urban issues. The large idea of the time was perhaps the end of history. You know, this was 5 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. The world had a sense of the Washington Consensus essentially ruled the sense of the way the World Bank engaged and most of the international donors engaged. as opposed to in the 70s, you had Robert McNamara on his large growth trajectory and getting involved in urban issues just a few years prior to the 1976 meeting. So you had a shift in kind of the international sense of what development entailed. You had a shift that no longer did you have the optimism of 1976. And in 1976, you had Kenya, Ghana still hadn't begun its slide into very deep negative growth for a long time period. Its GDP exceeded that of China by double, larger than Indonesia. Kenya was still growing quite rapidly. But now as you move from 76 to 96, world GDP increased by about 35%. And most of that was in the developed world. Africa, for example, was poorer in 1996 than it was the average African than he or she was in 1976. So you had a sense of pessimism, and the bank was leading this kind of change in policy paradigms with the Washington Consensus. But there was a sense that markets had prevailed, if you will, the fall of communism and so forth. I guess in terms of the U.S. in both of those periods had an extremely active housing and urban development program. The earlier period it had come out from my sense from the Progressive Alliance around Latin America, and it had extended around the world, and it was quite active. In 96 it was still very active and had shifted from housing and shelter to municipal development and development of credit markets for cities, as well as the initial focus on shelter. So if you come back, you have a sense of the world had become a little bit less optimistic, in terms of development prognosis. You had the bank becoming more insistent on a particular formula for growth. You had aid and the U.S., the biggest donor, still very actively involved. And then an outcome, as Mrs. Tibaijuka said yesterday, and I have difficulty with that name, was the sense that UN Habitat, from the top of the UN, decided that it needed an enormous shakeup. And from 1996, she was installed shortly thereafter. And I guess an outcome related to that was the creation of the Cities Alliance. Now, this was something that people tried to create in the 1996 meetings, but it didn't succeed. I think the shakeup at Habitat following the 1996 meetings and the installation of Mrs. Tibaijuka as a leading figure in the UN tried to give much more emphasis to these issues. And so you had a change from the old days of the population explosion to the sense that the markets had triumphed to more pessimism about growth, and the U.S. still very actively involved. Now, if you look next into the current period, what you have is substantially higher rates of growth. They've almost doubled and between 2016 and 1996. And 2016 is forecast to have another summit meeting of the sort of these 20-year anniversary meetings. And so in some sense, the Rio meeting is a road step, a stop on the way. So what's taking place on that? So first, think in terms of the perspective of the world economy. Again, this is one of the most rapid periods of growth ever, despite the crisis that we've had recently. And this is the first year in a decade that Africa will have negative growth for the continent. So there's no Pollyannish story here, but there is some reason for increased optimism. You also have the sense that the bank has moved away from this sense of the Washington Consensus should guide policy, and that, in fact, there's serious questions about whether the whole structural adjustment paradigm worked at all. And so there's more of a sense of, can countries select the binding constraints to growth? Can the multilaterals try to work with them to work on those constraints so that growth is more endemic and more widespread and more sustained? And so the bank, I think, quite reasonably become considerably more modest about its role and recognizes that it should follow the lead of the countries rather than take the lead as it tried to do in the 90s. Now, UN Habitat, where will that go? I mean, that's part of the question, or why I'm trying to pose this is, and I don't begin to have an answer to that, but I have some observations. But before we go there, I also have an observation about the U.S. One of the trends that's been going on since the 80s probably has been declining secular prices of agricultural products. And there's any number of reasons for this, but one is productivity. Now, the last couple of years, that's shifted, and agricultural prices have reversed, and they went up with some speed. Some, and particularly the World Bank, for example, attribute an awful lot of last year's to policies of the U.S. administration in terms of their subsidies for fuels and so forth, and the shift in agricultural production to do that. So whether that is a sign of different agricultural conditions or a sign of bad policies that could be eliminated, it remains to be seen. But the point I guess I'm getting at is, following this long decline in agricultural prices, and now you have a couple of years of run-up in them, you have a U.S. policy that seems to be shifting quite precipitously towards agricultural security, away from urban issues. And so I think at this point, the U.S., again, as the biggest donor, not the biggest relative share, but certainly the largest donor, has very little capacity at all in supporting urbanization issues around the world. The bank, while it's a big lender and it's lent large volumes of funds, is very cumbersome. It's very difficult for the bank as an institution to deal with neighborhood groups. It's very hard for it to do. You have what are, and I'm one of them, or was one of them, expensive international civil servants going into a noisy environment, and that's just the cost effectiveness has not worked. And the bank, while it's tried to do this, never reached the aspirations of doing 35 or 40 sites and service projects a year. It got up to maybe 4 or 5 in its best years. And so in some sense, the bank has not been able to address these issues. Aid is no longer addressing them. UN Habitat has gone from being established to spinning off the Cities Alliance as part of this restructuring Habitat to where will it go from here? And it has tried to set agendas and to have these convening forums to discuss these issues. And so I guess the speculation I would try to leave on the table is that as much as I don't subscribe to the kind of theories that such as David Harvey's, what I would distinctly Marxist perspective on the right to the city, and that whole literature, and Mike Davis's Planet of Slums, which I think is historically quite inaccurate, but both of those I do think have, this is an interesting moment in time in which, while their history or their theory may be one I disagree with, I tend to agree with their perspective. This is, I think, a worrying time in terms of what's happening in the world. The numbers are just incredible in terms of the rate of the numbers of people coming to cities around the world, and the capacity is extremely low. And so I go back to the beginning of this, and you think of late 60s in the States, which precipitated a public involvement in HUD, and I think this is quite widespread throughout Europe. Will we be facing those kinds of situations again? I think Mike Davis, in a sense, had a very apocryphal story of helicopters hovering over cities in the third world and so forth. And while I don't think his analysis gets him there, I do think there are concerns when you don't have the largest donor in the world actively engaged, the bank really not able to do this well. And I guess the only thing that gives me a bit of hope is there are people like these community organizations that Celine represents, that I think this is a new way to work with communities. And I think that at the same time, there's a lot of change in the aid architecture, which is just beginning and very important to change, and change in ways that more resources go to poor people in cities. I don't think that's recognized at all in the U.S., given the statements in terms of agricultural issues. I think the bank is willing but not very nimble. It's a big elephant stuck in the mud in this kind of process. And there is a need to change this architecture to put community groups in cities around the world in a much more predominant role in terms of allocating resources and being able to use resources that the donors would like to give, but to this point have been unable to. So where I think UN Habitat takes this remains to be seen, and I do think the issues with the right to the city, again, while I disagree with the theory, I think it is a concern, and it's one that needs increasing attention and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Matt?
I think that was a terrific macro-level introduction. And I was thinking as Bob was completing his thoughts that I'm going to focus very much on micro issues. And the reason why I think that way is more because the last 7 or 8 years I've been in the field working with entities like Spark and other local NGOs, local government, and my thought process leads me to specific interventions, specific experiences which lead me to think what is right to the city from the urban poor standpoint. I know this is one of the last sessions as part of the World Habitat Day, and you may have heard several data and numbers over the last few days. But let me give 2 or 3 small specific information which is relevant to the urban poor. I think that citizens must have right to the city just like them having access to water. Okay. That is a broad sort of a statement, but there are several ways it can be achieved. At the same time, it's that much more difficult for the urban poor to get to that point. In my case, have a social security number, you have a driver's license, you are part of the city, you can be part of any city. When you talk about urban poor, they have none of that. They don't even have an address. So what can be done to make them part of the city? Here's the challenge. In India, for example, you're talking about 150 million slum dwellers. Okay, that necessarily does not include all the urban slums. Now, this 150 million is just a number pulled from the air, and there isn't necessarily a scientific way of justifying that. And I'll get to that in a moment, where we talk about one of the projects CHF is doing. But that number is very critical. 10 years ago, the same number was 100 million. Okay, so in 10 years, there's 50 million more slum dwellers in India. So attacking or dealing with issues related to slums is the bottom. How do you start with addressing issues related to land tenure, housing, water, and sanitation? We have all heard about Dharavi and the planning that's gone on the last 2-3 years on how they are planning to redevelop Dharavi, one of the biggest slums in India. There are several models that has come out. I think they are very close to coming up with a solution. Perhaps Celine may expand more on that. But the interesting thing is, it is a 10,000 crore project, $2,500 million. Why is it that a project of that nature has such a huge price tag? And what I have seen is, it is not just Dharavi. There could be several slums in Mumbai and other second and third tier cities where similar market-driven or similar developer-driven options can be developed. And I'll get to a specific project a bit later. So having said this, I want to talk about 5 different projects which I think helps the urban poor get integrated to be part of the city. First one is waste pickers or waste collectors or waste rack pickers. We've had too many titles for that, but in India at least, waste pickers are the real bottom. There is no one below them. How do you, or what do we do to integrate them into part of the society is the challenge. One of the projects we are doing in Nagpur is how you, one, map them. Very difficult to find out who they are. There's no identity, there's no address, phone, nothing. So tracking them, mapping them was the first task. And the moment they are identified and the mapping is absorbed or owned by the city, they sort of have come into the limelight. Then the task is, how do you get women and children out of that business? Which we thought, and which our experience says was the simplest. Men are the most difficult to change. Men continue to want to be in that arena, want to continue doing waste picking for a variety of reasons. Women, we found that we could do a variety of things to mobilize them and get into other trades. Somewhat related to waste also, but some of them were also capable of taking up other jobs. When women got empowered, children automatically benefited by small things like daycare and play schools and stuff. We could transition them back into going back to school. How do you tackle men in waste picking? Men, the only avenue we found was how you can integrate them into the mainstream waste collection. Most cities now are going into formal collection, formal transportation, segregation, reuse, disposal. And in each of those chains, we found that men could be integrated. They continue to be in that profession, but in a formal way. They have identity cards, and we found that was perhaps their only way to get integrated into the city. This city has about 3,700 households which live on waste. And while we got the women and children out, we were able to get men integrated into the formal waste collection. Not all. Our success was only about 30-35%. But it's in progress. The question is, what happens in cities where you don't have an enabler like CHF who was doing this project? That's the challenge, but it's doable. Project number 2 is migrant laborers. Cities have acute shortage of the labor force. A city like Bangalore, for example, which has about 2 million upper middle class, are craving for support. Drivers, security, home-based care, construction-related laborers, masons. You'll see that in Bangalore, you almost won't find locals providing any of these services. The only trade or the only service you find Kannadigas provide is house support, cooks, those kind of things. That's more because locals prefer somebody who can speak the local language. So if you look at Bangalore, you will see that the painters typically are from Orissa, carpenters are from some other state, tile layers are from Rajasthan. So you can categorize, or you can sort of foresee the migration pattern based on labor and the service that is needed. We work with a local partner called LaborNet, where they aggregate support services, people of various trades, and aggregate also people like us who demand these services and link the two. We found that in the process, what they provide is simple things like police verification. So once these service providers are into the system, into the LaborNet system, they sort of get formalized. They are no longer seen as somebody from Uttar Pradesh or Orissa. They have now become part of Bangalore. Okay, people don't ask too many questions about your background and stuff. The certification from LaborNet is what is required. I think it's a terrific way of integrating labor, migrant labor, into the city and into doing business of providing services to the city citizens. Third one is urban governance. We found that, as I said earlier, 150 million slum dwellers. we found that there's no one city in all of India which can tell you how many people live in slums. There's no way. I've heard numbers from commissioners and people in the government who throw percentages. So 32% of our population live in slums. There's no idea where that number is coming from. Okay, so we undertook a project in Pune of mapping the poor. There are 524 slums, home to about 300,000 households. So we mapped them, and once we mapped them, we worked with the government on integrating that database into their system. And once a household is into that system, they automatically get access to services. Okay. Now, there's a lot of ifs and buts there. There are people from places which does not qualify to be gaining access to services. For example, there are Bangladeshis in some slums. There are, which cities usually avoid working in such slums. But once they are into the system, it doesn't look like, the system does not look into where the people are from. It sort of builds into a micro-planning process and people gain access to services. So this is sort of reverse governance, not urban governance, reverse governance, which entitles people to seek services and become part of the city. Fourth one is market-based strategies to do slum upgrading or slum redevelopment. India has launched this Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, which is a good thing, which provides the incentives for cities to look into slums, do redevelopment. Of course, it's subsidy-driven, but it is sort of getting into a habit. Once the subsidies dry out, you have to look into coming up with market-based solutions to providing services to slums or upgrading or development or redevelopment. Dharavi is a perfect example of how developer-driven model is coming out. There are several ways of doing it. It's just what we have found is cities don't really have the support or the technical assistance to develop these models of coming up with a transfer of development rights-based model or a model where you cross-subsidize within the slum sort of development. There are many ways of doing it. And one of the things we have seen is providing cities that support, providing cities a way to deal with slums on a sustainable way. Not that you do 5 or 7 slums every year when you have 1,200 slums in a city like Ahmedabad. This is one of the progressive cities. So how do you capacitate local governments to deal with slums in a way that they can make money, they can provide or continue to provide services to the slum dwellers? Okay. So how do you come up with policy? So how do you come up with capacity building support to local government to be proactive and develop market-based strategies is one way. I think many, many more citizens can get integrated into the city and get the right to live in a city. The fifth and the last point is a very recent experience of solar energy. We find that in most cities, most slums have access to the grid. Okay, legal or illegally, they gain access to electricity. But at the same time, you go to second tier, third tier, fourth tier cities, there are many slums who are far away from the grid, have no access to energy. And energy is one thing that can dramatically change the life of the poor. One of the projects we launched about 3 months ago is providing solar energy options to slum dwellers. Okay, we found a vendor who used LED technology, very affordable, to provide small products, 1,000 rupee or $22 worth of one light source, twice the amount, 2 light sources, thrice the amount, 2 light sources, and a fan, and so on and so forth. So we came up with 5 or 6 different product options like this and offered to a slum. We actually worked in 3 slums in Nagpur. And we found that people were buying it like crazy. I mean, we didn't have to do any marketing. In 1 week, almost every slum dweller, every household in that slum were giving us money to buy a solar option. But that's not my point. The point was, 3 weeks into the launch of this program, the local representatives or the local elected reps, they were immediately working on giving access to, or getting the slum access to the grid. Okay, what the point I'm making is, slum dwellers is a huge vote bank, and for that, small interventions like this is sufficient to enable them get integrated into the society. So these are the 5 different project experience I wanted to share with you, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Celine?
I love this idea of the road, and I will share with you my story of the road we walked on for the last 25 years in the city of Bombay, and how this has now spread as a social movement to Africa and Latin America. And it is purely an effort of slum dwellers and slum dweller organizations who've endeavored to begin to have a dialogue with their cities. And that has been our trajectory. So we started with the pavement dwellers in Bombay in the early 80s. And the pavement dwellers in Bombay then were the poorest of the city. They continue to be the poorest in our city, including the rag pickers. But most of our rag pickers live on pavements with their families. So there was a way of calling them pavement dwellers because that's where they lived on. They didn't live in a piece of land. And the pavement dwellers were very different from slum dwellers. And that was our first lesson, to begin to understand that there was a hierarchy among the urban poor, that you couldn't put them all in the same box, and that it was important for us to be able to see these nuances, and because you can't have one fix for everybody, and therefore you need to create solutions for different categories of the urban poor that suit them. Our first interaction with the pavement dwellers was with the women on these pavements, and we saw immense survival skills there, survival skills that we don't learn in our universities. We don't know how to go to a rationing office and get a ration card. We don't know how to go to a police station and begin to have a dialogue with the police station, with the police officer. We don't know how to enter a hospital, a public hospital, and access services. And these were the places these people frequented. And they had to figure out how to make the system work for them. And as middle class people who were trying to intervene in their lives, we realized that we knew as little as them, because we didn't know where to begin as well. And so together we started this journey of actually trying to see how to make the services in our neighborhood actually accessible to the people who most needed them, because the middle class and the rich go to private doctors. You don't need to go to a public hospital. You rarely go to a police station. You don't need a ration card because you get your food grains in the supermarket and you don't have to stand in long queues. So you saw there were 2 different lives in the same city, and there were 2 different cultures in the same city. And the first lessons that we began to learn were from these women, and they were very clear. They said, because then there was this notion that people had to go back to their villages, and I think till today many people continue to believe that people will go back to their villages. And if you spoke to these women, they'd say they have a house there, but there's no food to eat, so what do you want us to go back to? There was nothing to go back to. And if you came to the city, at least you could change your sari. You went to the second-hand market and you could get a few extra clothes, and you could have 3 meals a day, but you stayed on the street. So it was not the best choice, and it was not the ideal choice, but it was something where they were able to feed their families, and they had some. It's like the Indians coming to America, and the Indians in America don't even want to acknowledge that this is what happens back home, but it is the same trajectory. You come to a better off place to earn more money, and it's no different. And along the way, we realized that we had to actually change the way we spoke to our city, because the city responded to you with demolitions, with evictions, and one way of doing that was to actually demonstrate and scream and shout and tell the city government you're bad and you have to, And we realized that kind of response was not taking us anywhere, that we had to find a way of engaging the city, a way of proactively getting the city to understand who these poor were. Because most of these families work as domestic servants in all the middle class homes. They work as drivers, they are your petty vendors, they sell you fruit and veggies and all of that. And at the end of the day, you expect them to disappear. So we did our first pavement census in 1985, which actually proved what occupations these people did. And we didn't say whether it was good or bad. There was a Supreme Court judgment then that said that all pavement dwellers have to be thrown out of the city. And our response was, let's just put the facts together and give it to these bureaucrats, because maybe that will help them to rethink how they deal with the issue. And for the first time, we put basic data in place. All the women were gainfully employed. The men were gainfully employed. Most of the children didn't go to school because they had to stay home to look after the house, because in case there was a demolition squad, they had to protect their home. If you lived on the street, the school didn't acknowledge your street address, so you never got school admissions. And all of these things actually was very easy for us to tell the city, because it was a logic that actually the city never really looked at it like that. And all of them actually contribute to the informal economy in the city, but there was no way of actually aggregating that information. And there was nobody doing that. Till today, I'm hoping for some economists to go to my city and actually do a study of what the informal sector contributes to the city. Because without the informal sector, or without the informal economy, the city of Bombay would actually come to a standstill. So there were certain things that we did as homework before we began our conversation with the city, and we realized we couldn't go to the city empty-handed. So the first homework we did was to look at the vacant lands in the city. Because there were many myths about, oh, Bombay is it's a dense city, and there's no place for the rich, and how can you expect us to give houses to the poor? And there were all these myths related to land. And then the women and all of us said, let's go on picnics. And we started going on picnics to check out the vacant lands throughout the city, and we realized that there were a lot of vacant lands. At least on the master plan, it said reserved for low-cost housing. When you went to the side, there was a Panama cigarette factory, or there were other things. So you saw that there was a discrepancy in the master plan. And we realized, therefore, that if this can be manipulated, we can also work out a way to manipulate it, that it was not sacrosanct. And so these were our first lessons in beginning to understand land in our city. And the women would go to these lands. We'd have a day's picnic. We'd look at how much it would cost to commute from where they worked to if they moved to this piece of land. We checked out what were the possibilities of getting jobs in that vicinity if they had to move. All the questions that middle-class people ask when they move to a new place, but the poor never really ask these questions, because they're always moved like cows to some dump to some corner, and they're supposed to figure this out themselves. And this whole exercise was empowering not only for the pavement women, but for all of us who didn't know our city. Because for the first time, we were rediscovering our own city and all these nuances that you don't grow up to know automatically. So the second area of homework was savings. We realized that if the government gives you land, you still don't have money to build your house. So what you're supposed to do to actually get your act together and construct your house. And that's the first time we realized that in order to be able, there was no way the banks were even going to look at the face of these pavement dwellers, because they were nobody. So what do you do to actually become credit worthy? What homework did we have to put in place? And that's the time we realized that every month, every woman decided we'll put 50 rupees aside as a discipline, like we were putting a rent to our pavement house. And we will save that money, because at some point when we have this money together, we can go to the bank and have a conversation and say, can we have a loan? So these were the kind of very simple but the beginning steps that we took to actually begin to engage the city. Because if you went empty-handed, no bank would talk to you. And so the way to go there was, okay, this is the discipline we have, this is the kind of money we have, this is the rigor we've put over the last couple of years. So what can you give us in return? So whatever solution we found, we realized we had to engage the city in a proactive way, whether it was a bank, whether it was a police station, whether it was the city. The third area of homework obviously was the area of affordability, of an affordable house. And that's when we did our homework on actually going to different low-cost housing schemes throughout the country and actually figuring out what really worked and didn't work. And there were many housing schemes that are defined as low cost, but not really low cost. Because when you went there, you saw that people were never really involved in these designs. Some fancy architect or somebody does some mud house somewhere. And, you have every alternate brick is left open. For a poor person, their privacy is important. The fact that that house can stand on its feet for 50 years at least is important. The mud houses is for the elite who can afford to maintain that every year. It needs a lot of maintenance. And so you realize that it was important for us to break all these myths of, oh, you need to look at alternative building material, because conventional material was actually cheaper than alternative building material. I'm not generalizing this, but it's important to see it in the context you are in. So in Bombay, it was much cheaper for the communities to get conventional material at wholesale prices and to be sure that their house looked like a middle-class home, and to be assured that they didn't have to keep rebuilding their house every couple of years. And on the whole exercise of house building and house design, the women had a very important role to play, because they knew exactly how they wanted this house to be designed. And what we did was get the architect to translate this into a blueprint that the city accepted. So all these small things that we started in Bombay over time actually spread out to other cities in India. And it spread out to Africa, and it's beginning to go to Latin America. And the whole homework that we do is actually to begin to get the city to realize that poor people are an asset to their city. So whether it's savings, whether it's collecting information about their communities, most cities don't have information about their communities. They shy away from actually putting that information in place, because if they have that information, which means they have to do something about it. So one of the things the Slum Dwellers Federation decided was that they will collect their own data. And over time, they were able to actually get the city to come and endorse it and say, let's verify this data, and you check it and you stamp it. So now we actually have cadastral maps in Bombay which are stamped by the Federation, by the collector's office, and by the landowner. And this is information that's available to everybody. Now, this was never possible in the 80s. We were able to do this over time, and now the city now acknowledges that these communities exist there and that they have to do something about it. So over time, out of just sheer default, and because of so much of noise about foreign direct investment and wanting more people to come to the city, that the city is now beginning to actually change its policies in a way to make the city look more attractive to outsiders to come in. And the old-fashioned way would have been to do evictions, and now the new way is to actually say, let's do something about it. We don't really love them, but we have to do something about it, so let's find a solution together. And we think that's very important, that the city is now beginning to engage and beginning to listen, and this is happening throughout Africa. We just met the Municipal Commissioner of Lagos last week, and he was very interested. He says, I want to do something where my communities can come directly to the city office and be able to have a dialogue with us and do this. Now, this is a huge shift. And then you don't even need a middleman. You don't need NGOs like me. If the city is able to create a dialogue with the communities directly, and they are able to engage the communities with trying to collate this data, trying to find a solution. The unfortunate thing is that government education today doesn't really train government officials and bureaucrats, even if they are well-intentioned, to have a conversation with poor communities. The divide is so great that you always need agents and middle people like people like me to bridge the gap. Mm-hmm. And that's not really sustainable. And over time, it is important for cities to actually give direction to this process. And our job in Slum Dwellers International is to help cities to actually build their capacities to give direction to this process. And like most urban social movements, we also have our frailties and our vulnerabilities. Like you all know, when you scale up and you become huge, it's very difficult to take care of quality and to take care of the details. And as a movement, we are struggling with those things, and we are realizing that the problem is complex. And though the communities have lots of assets and lots of strengths, there are many things they just cannot do. And that's where we need professionals, and we need other kind of value added to actually come into this process so that we can all solve this problem together. So for me, Rio is really not important, or it's not a destination. If you talk to a woman on the streets of Bombay or in Sao Paulo, for them, they want to make sure that they have a secure and safe house for their children for the next 50 years, and they don't want their children to live in tin sheets and cardboard houses. And if we can all work towards resolving that and finding a solution to that. I know you're sitting far away in Washington, but we've realized that today distances really don't matter, and we need ideas, we need your intentions, we need allies for poor communities. Because till today you find people who are very dismissive or not so sure or look at it as another political party trying to fight for their rights or something like that. But if we all need to be secure in our own cities, it's important that we are able to look at the other half of our cities that are not so secure, because in their well-being lies our well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Washington may seem far away, but I think Anna Marie is going to take us to U.S. cities, and we'll see, but I have a feeling that some of these issues actually exist in the American context too. So.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Secretary Donovan and Deputy Secretary Sims, we're really pleased to be here, and thank you for inviting us to be part of the global dialogue. You referred to us as creating a community, and we've been working really hard to do that. When we came in January, the computers were blank, as you know. We didn't know who the previous partners were, and we set about to create this community, not just locally, nationally, but internationally. So we were really pleased to be part of the global dialogue and the opportunity to jump in right away into World Habitat Day. And the Secretary, as he said, he's going to be going to Rio, and he wants to be very intimately involved. We see our work not just as informing and just issuing press releases and putting out policies and programs, but really a lot of the principles that are laid out in the Right to the City of participatory planning and dialogue and fostering networks. So as I was talking yesterday to my colleague John Garrity, who's here from HUD, and he's been a valuable ally in helping us think through all these things, we were talking about how the Right to the City really does it does resonate with what we're doing here locally. We don't use, or nationally, we don't use that term here, and that's really been a lot of the work of the State Department, but we really took it to heart. And when we were looking at our 2010 budget, we saw that a lot of those principles really are inherent, stressing partnerships, stressing stakeholder engagement, stressing participatory planning. We've done things that I think are already very visible, like we've established an Office of Public Engagement that's really looking at how to get input, not just from our traditional industry groups and from elected officials, but how do the real people, how do ordinary residents really have an opportunity to opine on what we're doing. We're right now about to launch a strategic planning process, which will really look at what's our mission, our strategic goals over the next 6 years, and we're looking at how do we really delve deep into into where people live and into communities so that they can have input in that as well. And I think we do this because the Secretary and also the Deputy really understand that even though everything looks good, there's huge challenges. They're very disturbed, and you might have heard our deputy talk about this. In this country, you can determine a person's health outcomes very easily by just looking at the zip code and where they live. And they feel that that's not right. You shouldn't be able to determine outcomes by the geography. And so choices should not be determined by where you live. It should be a level playing field. The Secretary also talks a lot about when you choose a home, you choose those outcomes. And so he's trying to figure out how to not just look at the bricks and mortar and not just look at the housing, but look at all of the supports and all of the services so that people can have better outcomes. So there's 3 pieces that I wanted to talk about that I thought were important. One was how we're putting the back in HUD, and we're looking not just at, no, seriously. People think, I used to work at HUD 10 years ago, and when I came back, it hadn't changed. People, you tell them you work at HUD, and they start talking to you just about housing. HUD was never meant to be just about housing. HUD was meant to be about this layering of services so that folks would have a pipeline of opportunity. And so that's what we're really trying to do. And that looks at not just neighborhoods and housing and the bricks and mortar and the rental opportunities for affordable renting, and then for where appropriate, home ownership, but it really looks at layering. So we're looking at, for example, choice neighborhoods, which looks at what we've learned from Hope 6, which was an amazing opportunity to develop the mixed income, mixed use communities that are very much part of what many of you are doing, which are sustainable communities, which are walkable, livable, but also communities that do offer this opportunity that wouldn't be then so predicated on the zip code. So our choice neighborhoods looks at housing as the platform, but not just staying at housing, but housing, linking it with schools, linking it with all different types of services. And that's what we see as urban development, the UD. You can't do neighborhood revitalization if you don't have good schools. Think about it when you chose, those of you that are parents, what neighborhood. The first thing you look at is the schools. So as we're thinking about neighborhood revitalization, we're working very closely with the Department of Education so that that's part of the work. And our initiative, Choice, has the counter initiative or the complementing initiative, which is the Promise Neighborhoods at Department of Education, but it's looking at housing with supportive services with schools as part of the equation for neighborhood revitalization. We're looking at urban, suburban, and rural also. So we're not looking at just the cities, but we're looking at the common solutions. There's more and more we're looking at the metro regions. We're not looking at just the cities alone, because the cities alone, that's not where all the problems are. The problems are really collective. Where are the jobs? Where are the spatial mismatches? So we're looking at them not in isolation. To do that, we're working in collaboration very much with the White House Office of Urban Affairs. Some of you might have met Mr. Carrion, who heads that office, and he was at the Urban Forum on Monday afternoon, and so he's a partner in our working with communities across the country to determine how we can look at these issues jointly and look at place-based solutions and really bring all the partners together under the auspices of the White House and the agency, and bringing together to address those. Another piece which maybe some of you might have heard about is our Sustainable Communities Initiative. We're hoping that pretty soon Congress will give us authority to make it an office, but right now it's an initiative, and we're working very closely. Again, it's unprecedented, the partnerships that we have been embarking on. We're working on with as I told you, with education for choice neighborhoods, but also on sustainability. We're working with EPA, with the Department of Transportation. We're working with philanthropies. We were just at the Council of Foundations this past weekend because we really think that just all of HUD's money alone isn't going to solve any problems. So we are trying to figure out how do we work with the other agencies, how do we work with philanthropic dollars so we can align our research agenda, so we can align our dollars. And that's really proving to be helpful and very important. But when we think about sustainability, I think the different thing from before was that we're not just thinking about sustainability as the bricks and mortar, as we were doing with housing before, just the housing. We're thinking about sustainability not just as green, not just the buildings, but really what's sustainable socially and economically. So when we think about sustainability, I thought that too also intersected really nicely with the right to the city, because it talks about sustainability as inclusive communities and inclusive so that they would be accessible to all. Anybody who wanted to live in a particular zip code so that they could have those better outcomes should be able to have those choices and those opportunities. So we have 6 principles, and I don't know if I have a moment.
10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll tell you our 6 principles for our sustainability initiative, because I think that it was really exciting to see them come together. The federal government, those of you who have worked with us before, usually takes months, sometimes years, to come to agreement just within one agency. Our sustainable principles we came together across 3 agencies, HUD, DOT, and EPA, and when we sat down at the table, we had different language, but the concepts were the same, and within 1 week from launching the task force, we had 1 week later the secretaries, all 3 of them, were able to put forth these 6 principles, which was really, really heartening because it really set the tone for how the administration is working together. But I'll just share. So the first principle is providing more transportation choices. So that acknowledges that safe, reliable, and affordable transportation choices should be essential to making these communities livable. The second one was promoting equitable, affordable housing. And so that looks at how housing plays a role in a community and how it should be accessible to everyone. Third is the economic competitiveness, which is part of the neighborhood revitalization, because we really need to coordinate these these elements so that it's productive. Communities are productive. The fourth principle, support the existing communities. And so this looks at how we need to build on the existing families that are in local places and also the public investments that preserve our rural and open spaces. Fifth principle, expanding partnerships and leveraging investments. So that focuses on how we boost our capacity to think and to act regionally and holistically. And finally, the last principle is valuing communities and neighborhoods. And so that's ensuring that we're all working together to support cohesive, safe, healthy, and walkable communities, whether that's in our cities, in our suburbs, or in our rural areas. So I'm really heartened. We've been there, I guess, 8 months. We have a long ways to go. But we have a lot of support from the administration. We have a lot of support from our sister agencies, from all of you as partners in World Habitat Day and going on into Rio. And we're looking forward to really learning. I came here to share a little bit about what we're doing, but really more as a secretary is thinking about the delegation that we're going to lead to Rio and to the World Urban Forum. We want to listen. We want to really take your ideas and bring them back to HUD and really reinvigorate our thinking and go forth. And we look forward to your friendship and your thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I like to thank all our speakers for being so disciplined. We have a nice, comfortable 45 minutes for questions and discussions. The observation that Anna Maria just made about similar concepts but different language, it struck me as we moved from Bob's general overview down to more macro level discussion of macro level programs to what we just heard about U.S. policy, that indeed one of the problems that has separated a lot of the discussions in the past has to do not so much with the concepts but how people talk about it. And one of the themes that seems to emerge in all of the presentations are really the difficulties in creating linkages and pathways across boundaries. And they may be urban-rural, they may be between the World Bank and neighborhood communities, they may be within bureaucracies, they may be between residents and their government. But it's easy to talk about creating linkages, and it's very, very difficult to do. But therefore, I'm going to try to create an opportunity for you to have a linkage to our panelists. And why don't we go right now and see if there are questions or comments or observations. Please try to keep yourself focused and directed. We already have a couple of hands here. If you have your hands up, keep them up. I want to try to get a record, but we'll start here.
Sounds on the HUD.
Here's the microphone.
There's a microphone.
Here's the microphone.
Okay. This is for Mathew and Celine. You spoke about the micro level, and what I'm interested in is what is the role of the central government in India, and is the best role for the central government to just stay out of the way?
You want me to answer it? Yeah. Housing in India is a state government issue and not a central government issue. So though we have a national policy on housing, like my colleague puts it very nicely, he says it's like a beautiful woman, you can't find a man to marry it. It's a very nice policy, but very difficult to implement. But the state actually pulls the strings because they are the one who decides the urban development policy for the state, and it changes from state to state. Mathew, would you like to?
I think transferring of knowledge, transferring of capacities happen better when there is central government involvement. So yes, they should be involved to some extent, but not entirely pulling all the strings.
Okay, we have about 10 people.
Can I just comment on that just
Go
briefly? I think it's more than just transferring knowledge. I think Celine's group showed that you can provide toilets that with a subsidy at 1/10 the cost if it's done through the community group. And now the city of Bombay is talking about eliminating open defecation, a place that's had open defecation for about 25% of the population for a generation. That's a sea change, and that's so those subsidies are essential to do it, but the way those subsidies are provided is extremely, extremely important, and the way it has been provided traditionally, not just in India, but in most countries, is to pour more concrete rather than to work with kind of subtle organizations that can use the resources effectively and creatively.
Okay, we've had about 12 people have asked for the floor. I'm going to try to move around the room, and maybe we'll take a couple of comments. We'll go to Nora, and then we'll take this gentleman, and we'll come over here and then come up to the panel.
Thanks. There's a strong theme of empowerment, particularly in the comments of Celine and Matt. So my question is, what about political empowerment? As you work with people to get them recognized, to have them be part of the database, and for the city to have documents, does this allow them to become voters? And is this part of the resistance of the city, in your experience, to allowing them to take on this sort of formal identity that they don't want to?
Okay, we'll take 3 people first. We'll come here, and then, Lauren, we're going to go to the gentleman over there.
This is for Anna Marie. In looking at the economic competitiveness issue in neighborhoods, are you working with some of the large companies like Walmart and stuff whose box stores tend to destroy the infrastructure of neighborhoods to try and figure out how to either allow them to be there or, facilitate the continued existence of small stores and businesses?
Okay, and we'll take this gentleman, and then we'll come up.
No, I think I can be heard without it.
Okay. No, we need it for recording.
Oh, okay. The comments have focused on how to make the increasing concentration of population in the urbanized areas, how to make those urbanized areas more manageable, accessible, and equitable. But what the question that runs through my mind is that I think that the increasing urbanization has resulted in urban areas which are essentially dysfunctional and test the limits of resources. And that's not just a problem overseas, it's a problem nationally, and I would cite as one illustration, problems with water. For suggestions that, hey, the West Coast cannot continue to draw from Lake Mead, there's a limit to what can be attained. And I would be interested in any of the panelists commenting on that issue. What I imply is the need for regional decentralization.
Okay. Well, we have 3 questions on the panel. Any takers on either political empowerment, the issue of economic competitiveness, and large companies, and decentralization issues? Responses? Comments?
Political empowerment, I don't know if that is the impact. Them being able to vote, yes, at some point it'll get to that. Getting them on the database, onto the system is just the first step. I think, as I mentioned about the solar experience, it is a vote bank, or the ability of the communities to vote the right representatives, that is the bottom of the solution, or bottom of the problem. The other point I wanted to make was when people get into the system, they also feel they belong, and that transformation is almost immediate. And that by itself influences the voting patterns and so on and so forth. Politically, India is going into, as part of the decentralization, going into adding another layer into governance. I mean, I think that is more applicable in an urban setup than in a rural setup. And when that happens, such systems where you have people mapped out enable the process even better?
Could I just comment quickly? And the question of decentralization, I found Anna Maria's talk interesting and just the whole perspective fascinating, trying to link transport, EPA, and I would put energy in there too, as well as HUD, because the U.S. is the most car-dependent society in the world, and that's bad for competitiveness, it's bad for equity, it's bad, not to say the least, for the environment. It's unsustainable for the environment. And so trying to put the UD back in HUD, I think, is a great response to that. And you know, we can argue about cities versus non-cities, but you have the fixed capital stock in America is in the cities, and you've got your people there, and so you've got to move them around and heat them and so forth in ways that can be massively much more efficient. And it can only be done if the public sector works across the sector she's talking about. And so that's quite encouraging that someone's thinking about our cities for a change in terms of being places that are enormously important in terms of how we deal with the climate issues. So I cheers for HUD on that score.
Thank you. If I might take a stab at answering your question, we do see that communities need anchors, whether they be urban neighborhoods. For example, right here, I was just reading an article this morning about Columbia Heights in the Washington Post and how the Target really has brought these big box institutions 25% more people, like, use of the metro station there, and that then Target then also brings to the local mom and pop shops that are there increased folks. So we recognize that we need these anchors to be economic engines. We've been working specifically with hospitals and with universities as anchors. Those have been the folks that we, in this first couple of months, we've been reaching out to, and how can they function as engines, and how can they help us think about the communities. We are working with industries, although we haven't worked with the Walmarts yet, but I think that makes sense. We've just launched, just last week, a group that's called the Cities in Transition Work Group, and again, that's interagency, and that's being hosted by the DPC. And so the Cities in Transition Work Group is looking at cities like the Detroits and the Clevelands, who had the big box retailers, who had some kind of industry, who had these footprints and these populations that were huge, and then now they've lost those, both people and the work that grounded them. And how do we look at these cities, and how do we recreate them, rethink them? So that group is working with another group that's focusing on, there's another group that looks at the auto industry and the auto cities. But yes, to answer in short, we need to really be looking at across industries and across the sectors. That's why I was mentioning the philanthropic sector. The private sector needs to be part of the conversation.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions. We'll start here, and then Lauren will come over on this side.
Thank you. My name is Devin Brookins from the Urban Institute. Actually, Anna Marie just touched on what my question was. You all have been talking about linkages and some of the actors involved in addressing the challenges of rapid urbanization, but there hasn't been a real discussion about the impact that the private sector can have. I think that the emphasis on building kind of a participatory relationship between citizens, civil society, and local governments is very important. But the reality is that both of these 3 actors really have issues in terms of having an availability of resources. Obviously, the urban poor, or the groups in the hierarchy of urban poor, have a lack of resources or access to resources and credit, and local governments are often really strapped in terms of having access to capital as well. So you do need this other actor of the private sector to be involved. And I was wondering if there are some positive examples of private sector engagement, perhaps the cell phone industry in Africa actually working with informal workers to kind of help them in terms of establishing access to shelter. This is just an idea that came to mind, but I'm wondering if any of you have seen this in your work. Thank you.
Okay. Larry, we'll get you a microphone right now.
My name's Larry Hanna. My question is quite simple. And this is for everyone on the panel, do you think it would be useful to kind of try and tighten up the definition of what we're talking about here? I hear so many different things. I mean, some of it's kind of legal rights. Maybe some places in the world you actually need permission to live in a city. Somebody talked about ration cards. Then there's another part of the discussion about empowering the excluded. And there's another part of the discussion about access to services. And there's another part of the discussion that's the traditional set of issues about the line between the informal and formal sector. I still didn't hear anybody really talk about how these things all fit together. I heard Bob at the beginning say this, when you put the term right to the city, this usually implies that somebody else is going to pay for something that everybody can have. But so I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the looseness of the definition, and my question to the panel is, do you think it'd be helpful to try and tighten that up?
Bob?
Yes, I'm John Garrity with HUD. I was struck this morning by the issue of the fact that the poor are not recognized. They don't come in. You have to take steps to bring them into some kind of existence. For many people, the people who run the political and economic sectors. And so it's a matter of consciousness. They have to enter the consciousness of people before change is made. And in that regard, I was wondering, especially in India, given the great success of the movie Slumdog Millionaire in the United States, what effect, if any, did that movie have in India in bringing the problem to the forefront of concern?
First of all, the film was in English, so the slum dwellers would not go to a film that was in English. And the fact that it was called Slumdog Millionaire, now if it's translated into Hindi, it has a very derogatory and an insulting connotation, that you're actually equating a slum dweller to a dog. And that was the block. But if you went beyond that, I personally thought the film was very educative to somebody who didn't know anything about slum dwellers. And it showed the positive side, the entrepreneurship side of slum dwellers. It showed the side of experiential learning. And most of our leaders are like that. They just learn, they're streetwise. They're so smart. They're smarter than you and me, and you'd be surprised of how they get there. And it's all through experiential learning. And that film brings that out very nicely.
Do we have any takers on the question of engagement with the private sector, both, I think, globally and domestically in the U.S.? Any?
I have a response on technology. Okay.
Go ahead.
The migrant labor and linkages of service providers to service seekers, we use technology for bidding of jobs, for putting the jobs out there. If somebody needs a plumber, our partner has the database of plumbers in a certain geographical code, and we use technology of cell phone to give the word out to plumbers who would like to bid on that particular job. So this is just a beginning, but I think there's a lot more applications through cellular phone that you can and which will be the next step in the next 6 months. For example, you can track where the plumbers are through cell phones, not necessarily through GPS, but through cell. You can at least make out where a plumber is from the cell, which is a lot better than not knowing where they are. That way it optimizes your effort in linking a person to a job. Thank you.
We got a $1 million loan from Citibank for housing in Dharavi in Bombay. And after that, we never got the next loan. So you have one-off cases of private sector wanting to engage you, but within their institutions, I don't think there is the political will to extend themselves to something like this on a long-term basis. Bob, would you like to add to that?
Just kind of quickly, and it goes to your question and Larry's. I think you won't get private sector finance very much into slums until you start to do things like Celine's group has done in Bombay. And what they've done in terms of technology, if you will, is kind of social technology. What they've got, I was in Ghana and I talked to slum dwellers there, and they said, how do you organize? And they said this and this and this. And I said, well, that's funny. That's exactly what they do in Bombay. And they said, well, of course it is. We read their handbook. And the point, and what I say to Celine and her colleagues, is that you've McDonaldized slum organization. You know, you've made it into franchises that can quickly and innovate in social ways that can bring people together with social capital relatively quickly, which is a fantastic innovation. It's not the private sector, but once you get some of the basic issues, and to me the most basic dignity issues are related to water and sanitation, and once you get that, then you can get the private sector coming in, and I think you found that in Bombay, that once you have those provision for those kinds of services that the community can provide, Then you can see microfinance and so forth for home improvement and all kinds of things on top of that. But until you solve those first questions, and this is kind of to Larry's point of what issues are the rights, I think some of the basic issues are just those services that have extraordinary externalities. The death rates from bad sanitation for kids is just unbelievable. And I mean, everybody knows these numbers in different ways, but just what are the things that have the most profound effect on health and welfare? And getting organizations and rights around those, and then the rest build into the private sector. And so to make a long story short, I think the technological issues are the social innovations and how those bring people together to kind of do basic democracy to address questions.
Okay, there are a couple of people here. I want to see, I can't see the corner very well. Are there people who want to speak in the back? Then why don't we